In this video, I'm going to start off with just a brief introduction to one of the 20th century's great books, The Right and the Good by W.D. Ross. Now, Sir William David Ross, 1877 to 1971. The Right and the Good comes out around 1930. I'm just going to read it as R and G. Is often regarded as a high watermark in what's been referred to as ethical intuitionism. And as we go through parts of the text, I'll explain roughly what that means. But one of the things we should get right from the start is that he doesn't think we have mystical intuition. So ethical intuitionism is not to be taken that we have some sort of, very special, privileged kind of Platonic access. It's not like that. It still is the ability to recognize certain kinds of truths in certain situations, but Ross and a number of the scholars in the intuitionist tradition likened it also to our ability in mathematics to recognize truths. And if you're a really hardcore empiricist, you might find any of this highly suspect, but it's not a full-blown kind of mysticism that you can just immediately see moral truths with some sort of magical inner eye. Now, Ross is heavily influenced by the likes of Pritchard and Moore, but he was very critical of their work as well. Ross is also one of the great commentators and interpreters of Aristotle, and his work on Aristotle is admittedly a little bit dated, but nonetheless it's always interesting and I think still worth reading in many ways. And Aristotle's ideas and influence can be felt if you read into this book. So, and Aristotle, I wouldn't say exactly was an intuitionist in the way that Ross does, but there's some resemblances. Anyways, one of the things that Ross held was that now this is Ross's take on utilitarianism and Kantianism. So the utilitarian school, associated largely with Mill, and the deontological school, associated largely with Kant, but don't identify. Kant is a specific kind of Kant's thought is a specific kind of deontology. Mill's thought is a specific kind of consequentialism. But Ross held that they were both of these systems. They had their good points, but they oversimplified ethics. And roughly speaking, Ross looked at them as trying to provide a nice little tight theory of ethics. And Ross thinks that, there is something to a theory of ethics, of course, but it's not the whole story of ethics, hence the Aristotelian model that that comes out in the opening pages of the Nicomachean Ethics. That ethics isn't really a theory, and it's a mistake to think that it is. There's nothing wrong with ethics not being a theory. What's wrong is if you think it's a theory. And so Ross is very much like that. Like, we have to really get the subject matter of what ethics is all about. And of course, that was a big concern for G.E. Moore as well. In the opening passages of Principia, he stresses that the subject matter of ethics is something that has to be understood, and he thinks it's the good. So there's a Platonic ring to this. Ross is reacting to this in his own particular manner. Ross doesn't think you can have rigorous proofs in ethics, but it certainly doesn't mean that just everything goes. Now, as I said, the right and the good is regarded as one of the high watermarks of ethical intuitionism. C.D. Broad, who was a pretty important philosopher of the time, thought that the right and the good was probably one of the most important works in a generation. So, one of the key works of the 20th century is certainly something we could say of this book. Now, as I said, it's a work in deontology. So it's what happens to deontology after Kant? Well, let's look at Ross. The book presents arguably a fairly interesting and a rather compelling form of deontology in the sense that it's pluralistic. So you're not going to find any master principle, right? So it's not a deontology in the way that Kant's was, because his was a monistic one. So just to go back to Kant a little bit, Kant has, right, CI, categorical imperative. And yes, you might be thinking, wait a second, doesn't he have all three of those things at least? Like, what's going on here? Well, remember, Kant says, whether or not Kant is right about this, but Kant certainly is clear about his intention that the categorical imperative, all the different versions were just different versions of the same thing. So Kant has a monistic approach. So the various versions are all versions of the same underlying principle. Yes, the scholarly literature is full of people debating whether or not these different versions really are completely equivalent to each other. Fortunately, we can put that aside here. But the idea is that Kant's system is a monistic system. Ross has a number of principles that he talks about, and we'll look at those a little bit later. But for now, these are like these prima facie kinds of principles. And so this is you could argue, it's a weakened form of deontology in the sense that it's not as unified into one single principle like Kant's. And as I suggested earlier, although we have this idea of intuitionism and it's linked to math, Ross doesn't regard the ethical system that he's presenting really as a system in the sense that it's a strictly deductive model. And of course, Kant does, and Mill certainly does as well. That you can have a kind of quasi-science of ethics in the sense that it's, well, and for Kant it's an a priori kind of science, that it's a deductive system. Ross doesn't think you can do that. However, there are important parts where intuition plays a role. So in a sense, part of his ethics is grounded in intuition, and part of it is not. So it's a little bit of a hybrid of ideas here, and we'll see that unfold as we dig further into the work. Also, it's got a plurality with respect to the right and the good. The good is an important concept for Ross, and there's a plurality of goods, so plural, right? And of course, once again, we can contrast that with Kant, who was a monist, right? Kant is very clear that there's really only one good, and that is the goodwill. That is the truly good without qualification, and that's a goodwill. Everything else that we call good, yeah, sure, that's okay, but it's good with qualification. No, Ross thinks that there are definitely different kinds of goods, and it's not the case that you can reduce it. So there's plurality of moral requirements, plurality of intrinsic goods, no master principle. We will rely on basic kinds of moral requirements when we're deciding what to do. There's no intrinsic notion of good or evil in the sense to explain what we happen to think. And we'll see Ross sort of try to embed this notion of moral intuitionism in a kind of educated mind. So he thinks it's important in order to become properly moral that you have to have an educated and trained and sensitive mind. If you're wondering what exactly that means, think of it in the sense of how can you grow to appreciate art? Maybe certain kinds of art that's not very accessible. Well, you can learn how to appreciate great art by studying it and developing your mind such that you can learn to appreciate it and see the value in it. Now, some people say that this is all just old-fashioned criticism, but Ross would certainly say that, in a great work of art, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there, and you have to be trained to see it. Think of maybe a simpler example if you've ever seen an ultrasound. And I have seen them, and when I saw an ultrasound one time, I had no idea what I was looking at, but the doctor certainly did. And why is that? Well, the doctor has special training such that we were looking at the same ultrasound picture, but it takes the right kind of training to see what's going on in there. And that you can think of is the kind of intuition that Ross is talking about, a developed intuition. It's not a magical one, but it is something that you're seeing something that is there through your training, and you can get better at this. And we'll see more of how Ross thinks this. So again, there's a plurality of these prima facie principles. There's a plurality of goods. But yet he's not a consequentialist, and he's not a Kantian deontologist. So we are trying to understand how Ross fits into the history of ethics here. So he is definitely of the deontological school. Now, there are three main parts of Ross's sort of theory, and I'm a little bit reluctant to use the term theory, so I'll put it in scare quotes. That he thinks, okay, so you have an ethical non-naturalism, that moral properties like, okay, as we said, the right and the good. The right is a kind of moral property. It's not reducible. It's simple. It's non-natural. Moral statements, these are propositions, right? These are not just expressions of, he's not an emotivist or anything like that, where just, moral statements are not really true statements. They're just expressions of inner states or whatever. No, he doesn't think that. They're true, they are propositions in the sense that they have truth value. So, and these truth values are independent of us. And he's got, again, in addition to the non-naturalism, he has ethical intuitionism. So they can be, now the key thing is that moral propositions, they're true, false, and they're, again, let's go back to the notion of the ultrasound. It's something that you can recognize, right? It's not the result of a long inference. So moral truths can be known, according to Ross, without this long logical inference or systematic thought. And some philosophers in the empiricist tradition, in a lot of older British philosophy, did think we had a kind of moral vision or a moral sense. This is an old idea in philosophy, goes all the way back to Plato. Ross is not quite like this. He's got a rationalist side, that we can have non-empirical logic or non-empirical knowledge, much like we have of logic and mathematics, but again, not to try and bring in a special kind of vision. He relates more to Sidgwick in this, and Sidgwick too thought we had a kind of moral sort of intuition, but it wasn't any sort of special magical intuition. And the more that you exercise your reason, the more you can come to a deeper understanding and appreciation of the deeper principles. Now, the last, a third part is the deontological pluralism. As I said, the prima facie duties. Ross starts off by listing 7 of them. I'll talk about them in a little while. He says when he lists them, basically you have things like fidelity, reparation, gratitude, non-injury, beneficence, self-improvement. There's a lot of these kinds of prima facie principles, or prima facie duties, we should call them. And Ross, as I said, he starts off with 7 and then he reduces it a little bit later. It's best not to get too caught up on this. It's just kind of a listing to give you a flavor of what these things are about. Again, Ross is a pluralist, but not rigorous where he has a complete fabricated, and tight little laundry list that you just go through those and you can solve every moral problem. Because again, he doesn't think morality functions like that. He thought that that was a problem with other systems that were arguably too heavily influenced by science, especially someone like Kant, right, who thought you could have a logical system and you could deduce this and deduce the answers that you want. So in that sense, we've got sort of again, I like to think of Ross's work as a kind of hybrid with with a sort of a reference to mathematics, and yet kind of a reference ultimately to art. So the process of coming to a concrete ethical decision will involve this notion of an intuition, but getting from the intuition of the moral principle involved down to what am I going to do about it, right? That's not a strict logical deduction by any means. That's where it's kind of like getting to a question of understanding principles of interpreting art, but then coming to your final interpretation is going to be a matter of experience and a combination of principles, not simply a straightforward deduction. So that's roughly the general picture that we're trying to present. It's got sort of an Aristotelian background, flavored with Kant. So it's an interesting hybrid system, and one that we'll look into in more detail.